Hello, my name is Steve Adolf, and welcome to our topic, a user story template. So, let's say we're using user stories and we're starting to get interested in using user stories, but what exactly does a user story really look like? Now, if you ask 3 or 4 Agilists for a user story template, you're likely to get 9 to 12 different templates. The fact of the matter is there's a lot of different templates floating around out there for user stories. And possibly within your own organization, if you were to go and look at your templates, you'll see dozens of fields. And the question is, do we really need all of those? Well, I'm not sure in your organization, but there's a lot of specific information you may want to track with the user story. But what I'd like to do in this topic here is at least give you an explanation for the minimum amount of information you're probably going to need to carry with a user story. So a very simple template. So here's what I would suggest. There's at least 5 fields within a user story template. A title, that makes sense. A good story should have a title. There should be something that indicates how big the user story is, a size. Of course, the story itself, the couple of sentences that describe something of value to a stakeholder. The acceptance criteria. What are the testable criteria that we need for the product owner or customer representative to know that, yes, this story is done? And then with something I'm calling the notes, and this is where all that other information we need to track should be going. So here's an example of a user story. It has a name, upgrade seat. It's got a size, which we've called 13. There's a story. As a frequent flyer, I want to upgrade my seats such that I can fly more comfortably. So here's a statement of something that is actually valuable to a stakeholder. And let me tell you, as somebody who's nearly 6'5", this is really valuable to me. If I can upgrade my seat so I can fly more comfortably, yeah, this is valuable. And then our acceptance criteria. Here are the testable criteria that we have associated with this user story that we can use to verify that we have in fact completed and met the product owner or customer representative's needs. And finally, that section I'm calling notes. So the title. One thing I would tell you about the title is, first of all, recommended it should be a verb phrase name, and ideally an intention revealing name. Seriously, if you can't come up with a good verb phrase name for your user story, you really want to question whether or not you've got a good user story. You start coming up with names like upgrade user story or user story 1. You want to try and say, wait a minute, maybe we don't have a clear understanding of what is really needed here. Then just simply being able to come up with a good name for the user story and one that reveals the intention behind the user story says a lot for you. The second is the size. Now, you may not know yet what story points are or have gone through the section on agile estimating. All that I'm going to say with respect to that is the size of the story is not precisely how much effort it's going to take. You typically are not going to see this expressed in hours, and I would strongly advise against it. You want to be able to express how big this story is compared to other stories. Now, again, that topic of what exactly the size means in this case is beyond the scope of this topic here, but I just want to emphasize we want to be able to express what the size of the story is as part of our template or have a space to express it, but we certainly do not want to have like an estimate in the form of it's going to take somebody this many hours to do it. The user story, all right? The story itself. This is where a few sentences we have explaining some user need or some stakeholder need. Now, one thing I should explain here is you've probably seen most user stories or textbook stories expressed in this format. As a who, so some stakeholder, or you'll hear the term persona used a lot, I want to, okay, what is it that you want to do so that why? Okay, so this is kind of a neat format, right? Who wants the value out of? Who has the need? What is it they want? And really what's cool is why do they want that? Remember that part when we covered the 3 C's of user stories, the conversation? The why really helps facilitate the conversation. Now, this format was popularized by Mike Cohn. And what I would suggest is this is a format that you should really try to use to write your user story because it really helps try to capture who is the story valuable to, what is that's really needed, and why do they need it? What's the value on this? Now, of course, there's going to be situations where it's not really, you're not really going to be able to fit the story into this format very easily. Please don't try to say, well, I can't write it this way, so I'm going to revert back to my old style. What we're trying to avoid is this situation. We're trying to avoid so-called crud user stories. I've seen a lot of user stories written like this. Now, my question would be on this one, why are we trying to add a column to the database? It probably is because somebody has a need to have some kind of new information. Why do they have that need? So really try to avoid stories that look like this. Again, the best form is I really do like the as a, what role, who, I want, what is it you want, so that, and the why format. Not everything's going to fit comfortably into that format. But be careful. Don't let it get onto the slippery slope where you're going back to so-called crud stories. But use your judgment. Okay? Remember, the intention is to avoid crud stories. Remember what the intention behind user stories are. To capture that thin slice through the system, something that we can show to the stakeholders quickly to get their feedback. Then there's the acceptance criteria, right? These are the testable criteria that we use to confirm that the story is complete, right? We get these from the conversations that we have with the stakeholders. And, we use these to elaborate and clarify the story, and they provide our input for the acceptance testing. Usually, most people tend to write these as a bullet list. Finally, we get to this thing called notes. Notes is just sort of a place where this is where we put the myriads of petty details that for some reason or other we need to keep track of. Now, I just have the notes as a blanket for all the other information we might have to track with this user story. Consider something like maybe we need to track the author of the user story. Maybe we need to track a cost. Maybe we do need to track the hours estimate for this story. I'm just throwing that as supplemental or auxiliary information. I'm calling all of that notes. In your organization, this notes may be expand out to multiple fields. If you go into, for example, where your organization stores its user stories, whether that be Excel or version 1 or Rally or Jira, you'll probably see a number of fields, but I'm calling those collectively the notes because the additional fields there are very much going to be site specific. So ultimately you see we have a title, we have a size, we have the story, we have the acceptance criteria. Those I consider the absolutely essential of a user story. And then that fifth field is really the aggregation of everything else that we think is important to track with that user story. So that's a very simple template that you can use for your user stories. Now, remember one other thing too on all of this. There was a reason user stories were written on 3x5 or sometimes even 5x7-inch cards. It was to keep the story small, something that could be implemented and delivered by a development team in one iteration, right? 1 week or 2 week iteration, for example. So try to remember when we look at these templates, keep the user story small. The intent is to be able to deliver. The user story captures some valuable slice through the system, some valuable slice to the stakeholder, and we're able to show it to them with a week to 2 weeks development.